The soap suds dripped from Lieutenant Katia Ghost Volkov's hands as she scrubbed the mud-caked bumper of the transport jeep. The morning sun cast long shadows across forward operating base Crimson, somewhere deep in the disputed territories where maps still argued over borders. She worked methodically, the way she did everything precise, thorough, invisible. Most of the other pilots were still nursing hangovers from the previous night's celebration. Another successful escort mission. Another day closer to going home. The leather interior had taken the worst beating during yesterday's convoy run through the mountain passes. Dust, sweat, and something that might have been blood had worked its way into every crevice. As she pulled out the floor mats, her fingers caught on something wedged between the seats. A small metal object, no bigger than a silver dollar, glinted in the harsh desert light. Major Harrison's shadow fell across her work before she heard his boots on the gravel. Volkov. His voice carried that particular brand of authority that made junior officers straighten their spines involuntarily. She looked up, still holding the object, and felt her stomach drop into her combat boots. The Distinguished Marksman badge caught the light as it lay in her palm. Not just any badge. This one bore the crossed rifles of a designated marksman, the small wreath that indicated expert classification, and beneath it, a tiny silver scroll that made Harrison's eyes narrow. Long-range precision. The kind of designation that didn't appear on standard personnel files. The kind that meant someone had been places and done things that existed only in redacted reports. Interesting place for that to turn up, Lieutenant. Harrison's voice was careful, measured. Around them, the base continued its morning routine. Mechanics worked on aircraft engines, sending metallic echoes across the compound. The mess hall's generator hummed its familiar tune, but in the space between Katia and her commanding officer, silence stretched like a taut wire. She had been so careful. 3 years flying transport missions, keeping her head down, following orders, blending into the background noise of military bureaucracy. 3 years of letting people assume she was just another pilot who'd drawn the short straw for convoy escort duty. 3 years of watching younger, cockier aviators volunteer for the high-profile combat missions while she ferried supplies and personnel between checkpoints. The badge felt heavier than it should in her palm, such a small thing to carry so much weight. Harrison extended his hand, not demanding, just waiting. She could lie. She could claim she'd found it, that it had belonged to some previous driver. But the way he was looking at her, not with suspicion, but with recognition, told her that ship had already sailed into dangerous waters. Her call sign hadn't always been Ghost, because she was quiet. The distant sound of rotor blades approaching the landing zone filled the air between them. Another convoy was forming up. Another mission that would require steady hands and sharper eyes than anyone knew she possessed. She placed the badge in Harrison's palm and waited for her carefully constructed world to collapse. Report to my office at 1400 hours, Lieutenant. We need to talk about your next assignment. Harrison turned and walked away, the badge disappearing into his breast pocket. Behind him, Katia stood frozen beside the half-clean jeep, watching her anonymity evaporate like morning mist. The approaching helicopters grew louder. Through the chain-link fence surrounding the base, she could see the mountains where yesterday's convoy had taken fire, where her return shots had been so precise, so perfectly placed, that the enemy positions had gone silent within minutes, where she had hoped no one would notice the impossible accuracy of defensive fire from a simple transport pilot. Colonel Sarah Martinez emerged from the operations bunker, her attention focused on the incoming aircraft. Katia had always admired the colonel's reputation, a pilot's pilot, someone who'd earned respect through skill rather than politics. Someone who, according to base scuttlebutt, had once been called Valkyrie before a promotion moved her behind a desk. Volkov, Martinez called across the motor pool. You're flying today. Phoenix Flight needs a replacement pilot for the Kandahar run. The words hit her like a physical blow. Phoenix Flight. The unit that handled the deep insertions, the missions that didn't make it into official reports, the kind of flying that separated the wheat from the chaff, where pilot error meant body bags instead of paperwork. She nodded, not trusting her voice. Around her, the base continued its relentless rhythm. Soldiers prepared for another day in a war that had no clear front lines. Mechanics signed off on aircraft that would carry precious cargo through hostile skies. Radio operators monitored frequencies that crackled with coded transmissions from units that officially didn't exist. But Katia felt the weight of attention now. The way Sergeant First Class Davis looked up from his engine maintenance, noting which aircraft she approached. The manner in which Captain Reynolds' conversation with his co-pilot stopped mid-sentence as she walked past. Word traveled fast in a place where everyone's survival depended on knowing exactly who could be trusted with what kind of secrets. Her helmet bag felt heavier as she collected her flight gear. Inside, beneath the standard-issue equipment, lay another reminder of the life she tried to leave behind. A patch, not regulation, not something that appeared in any manual, just a simple gray wolf's head against a black background with 2 words stitched below in silver thread: Silent Death. The name they'd called her unit in places where official maps showed only empty desert. The designation that had followed her through 3 deployments before she'd finally requested transfer to transport duty. Before she decided that flying cargo was preferable to the alternative missions that had earned her that marksman's badge. Katia stuffed the patch deeper into her bag and headed toward the flight line. Phoenix Flight was already conducting their pre-mission briefing. Through the hangar's open doors, she could see the familiar sight of pilots bent over maps, marking waypoints and contingency routes. The same ritual she'd performed dozens of times in different places, with different people who'd trusted her to bring them home. The difference was that this time Major Harrison would be watching. This time, Colonel Martinez would be evaluating every decision, every radio call, every course correction. This time, her past was walking beside her like a shadow that had finally caught up. The sun climbed higher over forward operating base Crimson as Lieutenant Katia Ghost Volkov approached Phoenix Flight's operational briefing. Behind her, the half-clean Jeep sat abandoned beside the motor pool, its secrets finally exposed to the harsh light of a desert morning that would change everything. Captain Alina, Viper Kosilov looked up as Katia entered the briefing room, where most pilots carried themselves with the casual confidence of aviators who'd learned to dance with gravity and win. Viper moved with the deliberate precision of someone who'd survived missions that existed only in classified files. Her flight suit bore the subdued patches of units that weren't supposed to exist, and her eyes held the particular stillness of someone who'd seen too much and remembered everything. "You must be our replacement pilot," Viper said, extending a hand that bore faint scars across the knuckles. "Alina Kosilov, they call me Viper." Her accent carried traces of Eastern European consonants, softened by years of American military briefings but never completely erased. "Katia Volkov, Ghost." The call sign felt strange on her lips. For 3 years, she'd been just Volkov or Lieutenant to most people. Hearing herself use the name that had once struck fear into enemy radio intercepts felt like putting on an old uniform that no longer quite fit. "Ghost?" Viper repeated the word slowly as if tasting it. "Interesting. I flew with a pilot called Ghost once. Different theater, different war. She could put ordnance on target from ranges that made enemy radar operators think they were seeing things." Her eyes studied Katia with the professional assessment of one predator recognizing another. But that was someone else, wasn't it? Before Katia could respond, the briefing room door opened. Major Harrison entered, followed by a man she didn't recognize, tall, thin, with the kind of weathered face that spoke of decades spent in places where luxury meant clean water and air conditioning was a distant memory. His flight suit bore no name tape, no unit patches, just the winged insignia of a pilot and a single ribbon that Katia recognized: the Intelligence Star. The kind of decoration they gave to people who'd done things that couldn't be discussed in polite company. Ladies, meet your mission commander for today's operation, Harrison said. Colonel Marcus Reaper Singh. He'll be briefing you on the specifics. Singh's voice carried the flat affect of someone who delivered too many briefings that began with phrases like voluntary participation and ended with statistics about acceptable losses. Kandahar Province. Grid reference Oscar 77. Intelligence assets report enemy movement in the Spin Boldak corridor. Your mission is transport and observation. You'll be carrying a Special Activities Division team to a forward observation post. He pointed to a map where red circles marked known enemy positions like a constellation of threat. Primary concern is surface-to-air missile systems. MA and PADS confirmed in the area. Russian-made Igla systems, probably supplied through Iranian intermediaries. Range approximately 4,000 meters, so you'll need to maintain tactical altitude and approach vectors. Katia studied the map with the professional interest of someone who'd flown similar missions in similar places. The terrain looked familiar, rocky, unforgiving, full of places where an enemy could hide a missile launcher or set up an ambush. The kind of landscape that punished mistakes and rewarded paranoia. Rules of engagement, Viper asked. Defensive only unless specifically authorized by ground control. Remember, this is officially a routine transport mission. The cargo you're carrying doesn't exist, and neither does this briefing if anyone asks later. Singh's smile held no warmth. Questions? Katia raised her hand. Aircraft specifications. A 60 Blackhawk. Latest avionics package, defensive countermeasures, but no offensive armament beyond door-mounted M240s. Your crew chief will be Sergeant Rodriguez, 15 years experience, 3 combat deployments. Singh looked at his watch. Wheels up in 45 minutes. Any other questions? The room fell silent except for the distant sound of aircraft engines starting up across the base. Through the briefing room's single window, Katia could see maintenance crews making final preparations on a helicopter that looked identical to dozens of others she'd flown. But something about the way the ground crew moved, with extra care, extra attention to detail, suggested this wasn't just another routine transport mission. Dismissed, Singh said. Good hunting. As they filed out of the briefing room, Viper fell into step beside Katia. You know this kind of mission, don't you? She asked quietly. The way you looked at that map, the questions you asked, that's not transport pilot thinking. Katia kept walking, her helmet bag slung over her shoulder, the weight of hidden patches and buried secrets pressing against her spine. Around them, the base hummed with the controlled chaos of military operations. Soldiers moved with purpose, vehicles carried supplies toward the flight line, and radio antennas reached toward a sky that held both promise and threat. I've done some flying, she said finally. Viper laughed, a sound that held both amusement and understanding. Sister, we've all done some flying. The question is what kind of flying, and whether we're still the same people who climbed out of those cockpits. She paused beside a maintenance hangar, where the shadow offered momentary relief from the desert sun. The ghost I knew, she could thread a helicopter through missile envelopes that would make most pilots soil themselves, but she also carried more weight than any aircraft should have to bear. Sometimes the hardest missions are the ones that bring us home. Before Katia could respond, Viper was walking away, her flight suit disappearing into the organized chaos of pre-mission preparations. Left alone beside the hangar, Katia felt the desert wind carry the scent of aviation fuel and distant gunpowder. The smell of a war that never quite ended, just moved from one grid square to another, carrying its ghosts and its secrets across landscapes that looked different but felt exactly the same. Sergeant Rodriguez was already conducting his pre-flight inspection when she reached the aircraft. A compact man with graying hair and hands that moved with the confidence of someone who'd kept helicopters flying in conditions that would challenge the aircraft's designers. He looked up as she approached. You the pilot? He asked. His voice carried the particular authority of senior NCOs who'd learned that survival often depended on knowing exactly who could be trusted with precious cargo and human lives. Lieutenant Volkov. Rodriguez nodded slowly, his eyes taking in details that most people would miss. The way she checked the aircraft's external condition, the manner in which she examined the flight controls, the professional interest she showed in the defensive systems that weren't supposed to be part of a routine transport mission. "Heard about you," he said finally. "Word is you know your way around situations that don't make it into after-action reports." She looked at him sharply. "What exactly did you hear?" "Enough to know that when Major Harrison personally selects aircrew for Phoenix flight missions, it's usually because someone needs pilots who can handle complications." Rodriguez continued his inspection, checking hydraulic lines and electrical connections with methodical precision. "The cargo we're carrying today, Special Activities Division, they don't travel with pilots who learn to fly at the training command." The cargo door stood open, revealing a passenger compartment that had been modified for purposes that weren't entirely clear. Additional communication equipment, hardened cases that could contain anything from surveillance gear to weapons that didn't appear in standard inventories, and 4 seats that would be occupied by people whose names wouldn't appear on any flight manifest. "How many missions like this have you flown, Sergeant?" Katia asked. Rodriguez paused in his inspection, a hydraulic fitting held loosely in his weathered hands. "Enough to know that the ones who make it home are usually the ones who remember that everyone's got secrets. Pilots, passengers, even crew chiefs who have been fixing helicopters since before some of these kids were born." He resumed his work, but his voice carried the weight of experience earned in places that didn't exist on official maps. "The question is whether those secrets help keep everyone alive, or whether they get people killed." Across the flight line, Viper was conducting her own pre-flight inspection on a second aircraft. Phoenix flight apparently consisted of 2 helicopters, flying in formation to provide mutual support and redundancy. The kind of mission planning that suggested someone expected trouble. Major Harrison appeared at Katia's shoulder, his approach silent despite the heavy combat boots and equipment that marked him as an infantry officer temporarily assigned to aviation support duties. "Everything looked good, Lieutenant." "Aircraft checks out. Sergeant Rodriguez knows his job." She paused, watching maintenance crews make final adjustments to both helicopters. "Sir, about that badge." "What badge?" Harrison's expression remained neutral, but something in his eyes suggested that certain conversations would be better held after the current mission was complete. "Your passenger manifest is classified. Your route is classified. Your destination is classified. But your orders are simple. Get them there, get them back, keep everyone alive." He handed her a sealed envelope marked with security classifications that made it clear this mission existed in the gray areas between official military operations and activities that couldn't be acknowledged publicly. "Open that if things go sideways. Not before." The envelope felt heavier than paper had any right to feel. Around them, the controlled chaos of military aviation continued its familiar rhythm. Ground crews made final preparations. Air traffic controllers coordinated takeoff sequences. Weather reports crackled over radio frequencies that connected this small outpost to the larger machinery of modern warfare. But in the space between Harrison's words and the sealed orders in her hands, Katia felt the weight of recognition. This wasn't just another transport mission. This was a test. A chance to prove that 3 years of flying cargo runs hadn't dulled the skills that had once made her call sign synonymous with impossible missions completed against overwhelming odds. "Understood, sir." She tucked the envelope into her flight suit, next to the patch that bore the image of a gray wolf and the words that had once struck fear into enemy communications intercepts. Harrison nodded and walked away, leaving her alone with Rodriguez and the aircraft that would carry them into whatever waited in the mountains of Kandahar province. In the distance, She could see their passengers approaching, four figures in modified combat gear, carrying equipment that suggested their mission involved more than simple observation. The leader was a woman, compact and efficient, with the kind of purposeful movement that marked professional soldiers who'd learned to operate in environments where mistakes weren't survivable. Her gear bore no identifying marks, no unit patches, no name tapes, just the neutral desert camouflage of operators who worked in the spaces between official military units and classified activities. "You are pilot?" the woman asked as she approached the aircraft. "Lieutenant Volkov." "Call me Phoenix." The woman extended a gloved hand that gripped with the controlled strength of someone who'd learned that first impressions often determined survival odds. "We'll be traveling light and moving fast. Hope you're comfortable with tactical approaches." "I've done some tactical flying." Phoenix smiled, an expression that didn't reach her eyes. "Good. Where we're going, the textbook approaches will get everyone killed." She gestured to her three companions, who were loading their equipment into the helicopter's passenger compartment with the efficient movements of people who'd done this many times before. "The LZ is hot. Anti-aircraft systems confirmed in the area. We'll need someone who can thread the needle." Katia watched the team secure their gear with professional interest. Whatever their mission, they were prepared for complications. Night vision equipment, advanced communications gear, weapons that weren't standard military issue, and something else, the particular alertness of people who expected to be shot at and had made peace with that probability. "Flight time to target?" Phoenix asked. 2 hours, assuming we maintain tactical altitude and avoid known threat areas. Katia consulted the map that Harrison had provided, nodding the red circles that marked enemy positions like a constellation of danger. "We'll have Viper's aircraft providing overwatch." Phoenix nodded approvingly. Viper, heard of her, good pilot, steady hands. She paused beside the aircraft, her attention focused on the mountain ranges that marked their destination. "The people we're going to meet have been watching those positions for 3 weeks. They've got intelligence that could change how this whole operation unfolds, but they need extraction, and they need it today." "What kind of intelligence?" "The kind that doesn't get discussed over unsecured communications." Phoenix's smile returned, still not reaching her eyes. "Let's just say that some very bad people are planning something very unpleasant, and we're the only ones in position to stop them." Rodriguez completed his pre-flight inspection and gave Katia the thumbs up. Both helicopters were ready for departure. Weather conditions were acceptable. All that remained was to start the engines and begin a mission that would test whether 3 years of flying transport missions had dulled the skills that had once made Lieutenant Katia, Ghost, Volkov a legend in units that didn't officially exist. She strapped herself into the pilot's seat and began the startup sequence. The familiar vibration of turbine engines coming online filled the cockpit. Outside, ground crews cleared the landing zone and prepared for departure. Radio frequencies crackled with routine traffic control communications that masked the true nature of their mission. "Phoenix Flight Tower, clear for departure, good hunting." Katia keyed her radio. "Phoenix Flight copies, departing controlled airspace. See you on the flip side." The helicopter lifted off from forward operating Base Crimson as the morning sun climbed higher into a desert sky that promised heat, danger, and the kind of mission that would remind everyone involved why some pilots earned call signs that their enemies learned to fear. Below them, the base grew smaller until it resembled a collection of toys scattered across an endless sandbox. Ahead lay the mountains of Kandahar province, where intelligence assets waited for extraction and enemy missile systems waited for unwary aircraft. Between the relative safety of the base and the uncertain dangers of their destination stretched 2 hours of flying that would test every skill Katia had learned in her previous life as someone who specialized in impossible missions. Beside her, Viper's aircraft maintained formation with the relaxed precision of experienced pilots who'd learned to trust each other's abilities. On the radio, their communication was professional, but carried undertones of mutual respect that suggested both women understood they were flying into something that would require more than standard transport pilot training. Ghost Viper, how's your passenger load? 4 souls plus equipment. They seem to know what they're about. Roger that, same here, my cargo is interesting. The conversation was deliberately vague, conducted over frequencies that were theoretically secure, but could never be completely trusted. In the passenger compartment, Phoenix and her team maintained the alert relaxation of professional soldiers who'd learned to conserve energy between moments of extreme danger. Rodriguez monitored his instruments with the methodical attention of someone who'd kept aircraft flying through conditions that would challenge manufacturers' specifications. His headset crackled occasionally with updates from ground control, weather reports, and intelligence briefings that painted an increasingly complex picture of their destination. LZ Charlie is reporting movement in sectors 7 and 9, ground control transmitted. Possible hostile observation posts. Recommend approach Vector Delta 4 with tactical descent at grid reference Oscar 77. Katia acknowledged the transmission while mentally calculating the new approach route. Delta 4 would take them through a valley system that offered cover from visual observation, but also channeled their flight path through terrain that could hide surface-to-air missile systems. The kind of tactical problem that required pilots who understood the delicate balance between stealth and vulnerability. Ghost, you getting this weather update? Viper's voice carried concern. The meteorological report indicated deteriorating conditions ahead, increasing winds, reduced visibility, and the kind of atmospheric turbulence that made precise flying challenging under the best circumstances. Combined with enemy anti-aircraft systems and unknown threats at their destination, the mission was becoming significantly more complex. Copy the weather, still within operational parameters. Agreed, but we're going to earn our flight pay today. Through the cockpit windows, the landscape below changed from desert scrub to rocky foothills that marked the beginning of the mountain ranges where their mission would unfold. The terrain grew more forbidding with each mile, full of ravines and ridgelines that could hide anything from harmless shepherds to sophisticated missile systems operated by people who'd learned to wage war against helicopters. In the passenger compartment, Phoenix was reviewing digital maps on a ruggedized tablet that displayed information not available to civilian satellite systems. Her 3 companions checked their equipment with the quiet efficiency of operators who'd learned that survival often depended on details that seemed insignificant until lives hung in the balance. Pilot, Phoenix's voice came through the intercom system. How familiar are you with tactical extractions under fire? The question hung in the air like a challenge. For 3 years, Katia had flown routine missions, avoiding the kind of operations that had once defined her military service. Transport runs between secure bases, cargo deliveries to established outposts, the kind of flying that kept pilots alive and allowed them to accumulate retirement points without accumulating trauma. I've done some challenging flying, she replied carefully. Phoenix laughed, a sound that carried both amusement and something darker. Sister, where we're going, challenging doesn't begin to cover it. The people we're extracting have been under observation for 72 hours. Enemy forces know they're there. The only reason they haven't been overrun is that nobody wants to assault a position that might contain American intelligence assets without knowing exactly what those assets have learned. What have they learned? That's classified above my pay grade, but it's important enough that someone decided to risk 2 aircraft and 12 lives to get them out. Phoenix paused, her attention focused on the mountainous terrain ahead. The extraction point is a ridgeline approximately 8,000 feet above sea level. Landing zone is marginal, barely large enough for 1 aircraft, with approaches that would make a test pilot nervous. Rodriguez's voice crackled through the intercom. Ma'am, I've worked extractions from positions like that. The key is getting in fast, loading passengers, and getting out before anyone can get a missile lock. But it requires pilots who can handle precision flying under combat conditions. The implication was clear. This mission would test whether Lieutenant Katia Ghost Volkov still possessed the skills that had once made her a legend among units that specialized in impossible extractions from untenable positions. 3 years of flying transport missions had been a deliberate choice, an attempt to escape the kind of flying that left pilots with nightmares and survivor's guilt. But escape, she was beginning to realize, was an illusion. Skills like hers didn't disappear just because someone changed assignments. Reputations earned in classified operations had a way of following pilots no matter how far they traveled or how desperately they tried to become anonymous. ETA to target area 30 minutes, she announced over the intercom. Copy that. Phoenix team is ready for fast rope insertion if the LZ proves unsuitable for landing. Fast rope insertion. The words carried memories of other missions, other aircraft, other passengers who'd trusted her to deliver them safely to places where safety was measured in seconds rather than permanent security. The kind of flying that separated professional aviators from pilots who'd learned their trade in peacetime training exercises. Ahead, the mountains of Kandahar province rose like a wall against the morning sky. Somewhere in those peaks waited intelligence assets whose information was valuable enough to risk a complex extraction mission. Somewhere in those same peaks waited enemy forces who'd learned to use American helicopters as target practice. Between the relative safety of their current position and the uncertain dangers of their destination lay 30 minutes of flying that would determine whether Katia's carefully constructed anonymity had been protection or preparation for a mission that would remind everyone involved why some pilots earned call signs that their enemies learned to fear. The radio crackled with an update from ground control that made both pilots tense. Phoenix flight, be advised. Intercepted enemy communications indicate increased activity in your target area. Recommend heightened alert status. Viper's response was immediate. Copy ground control. Phoenix flight is weapons hot and ready for contingencies. Weapons hot. The phrase transformed their mission from routine transport to combat operations with 2 words. Katia felt muscle memory taking over as her hands moved automatically to switches and controls that she hadn't touched in 3 years, but still knew by instinct developed through training, that had been designed to keep pilots alive in situations where hesitation meant death. In the passenger compartment, Phoenix and her team conducted final equipment checks with the heightened alertness of professionals who understood that their extraction might become significantly more complex than originally planned. Outside the aircraft windows, the landscape below offered countless positions where enemy forces could observe their approach and coordinate defensive measures. Ghost, how's your comfort level with evasive maneuvers? Viper's question was professional, but Katia could hear the underlying concern. Combat flying required split-second decisions and precise control inputs that could mean the difference between successful extraction and aircraft loss. Pilots who'd spent years flying routine missions sometimes found that their edge had dulled when they needed it most. I remember the basics. Good, because something tells me we're going to need more than basics before this mission is complete. Through the cockpit windscreen, the mountains ahead looked peaceful in the morning sunlight. But appearances, as both pilots had learned through hard experience, could be fatally deceiving. Beauty often masked danger in places where wars were fought by people who'd learned to turn any terrain into a battlefield. Rodriguez's voice cut through their conversation. Ladies, I'm seeing electronic signatures that suggest active radar systems ahead. Someone's trying to get a lock on our position. The news sent a chill through both aircraft. Radar signatures meant surface-to-air missile systems. Professional-grade threats operated by people who understood how to engage military helicopters. the kind of opposition that required pilots who could think 3 moves ahead while flying aircraft at the absolute limits of their performance envelopes. "Time to earn our flight pay," Viper transmitted. "Copy that. Phoenix flight is going tactical." Katia pushed the helicopter into a descent that would take them below the radar horizon, while maintaining enough altitude to clear terrain obstacles. The maneuver required precise calculation of airspeed, altitude, and terrain clearance, the kind of flying that drew a thin line between successful evasion and controlled flight into terrain. Behind her, Phoenix and her team maintained professional silence despite the increasing complexity of their situation. Whatever intelligence they were being sent to extract was valuable enough to justify flying into a tactical situation that was deteriorating with each radio transmission. The sealed envelope in Katia's flight suit felt heavier as she realized their mission was becoming exactly the kind of operation she'd spent 3 years trying to avoid. But some missions, she was learning, found the pilots they needed regardless of those pilots' preferences for quiet anonymity and routine assignments. Ahead lay a ridgeline extraction under combat conditions. Behind lay the safety of forward operating Base Crimson and the comfortable illusion that Lieutenant Katia Ghost Volkov could remain hidden among the routine transport pilots forever. Between the two lay 30 minutes of flying that would test every skill she'd learned and determine whether her reputation had been earned through luck or through abilities that time and intention couldn't completely erode. The mountains of Kandahar province waited with the patient hostility of terrain that had witnessed too many conflicts and claimed too many aircraft. Soon, they would discover whether Phoenix Flight possessed the skills necessary to add another successful mission to their operational record, or whether they would join the growing list of aircrews who'd learned too late that some extractions required more than courage and good intentions. Rodriguez's instruments painted an increasingly complex picture of their tactical situation. Multiple radar sources, electronic signatures that suggested sophisticated anti-aircraft systems, and somewhere ahead, intelligence assets who possessed information valuable enough to justify risking 2 helicopters and 12 lives in an extraction that was becoming more dangerous with each passing minute. Phoenix Flight, this is ground control. Latest intelligence indicates enemy forces are converging on the extraction site. You are cleared for immediate tactical approach and fast extraction protocols. The transmission confirmed what both pilots had begun to suspect. Their mission had evolved from routine transport to combat search and rescue. The kind of flying that required pilots who could operate aircraft at the absolute limits of their performance, while making life-or-death decisions with incomplete information and enemy forces actively trying to prevent mission success. Ground control, Phoenix Flight copies. We're going in. Lieutenant Katia Ghost Volkov pushed the helicopter toward a ridgeline extraction that would test whether 3 years of transport flying had dulled the skills that had once made her call sign synonymous with impossible missions completed against overwhelming odds. Behind her, operators from units that didn't officially exist prepared for an extraction that would determine whether their intelligence was worth the lives being risked to retrieve it. The morning sun climbed higher over mountains that held secrets worth dying for and enemies who'd learned to use American courage against American forces. Between courage and tragedy lay the thin margin of professional competence that separated successful extractions from memorial services and classified casualty reports. Phoenix Flight descended toward their destiny with the controlled precision of military aviators, who'd learned that some missions defined not just careers, but the kind of people they would become when the comfortable illusions of peacetime service finally fell away under the harsh light of combat operations. The radar warning receiver's steady tone filled both cockpits as enemy systems attempted to establish firing solutions on the approaching helicopters. Professional anti-aircraft operators were tracking Phoenix Flight with equipment sophisticated enough to pose serious threats to military aircraft operating in hostile territory. Ghost, I'm showing multiple acquisition attempts from 3 different sources, Viper reported. Recommend immediate evasive action. Katia pushed the helicopter into a series of rapid altitude and heading changes designed to break radar locks while maintaining their approach toward the extraction site. The maneuvers required precise control of airspeed and power settings, flying the aircraft at the edge of its performance envelope while navigating terrain that offered minimal margin for error. Phoenix, how much time do your people need on the ground? 30 seconds for loading, maybe less if everyone moves fast. 30 seconds. In combat aviation, half a minute could feel like hours when enemy missile systems were actively trying to achieve weapons lock. The extraction would require arriving at the landing zone, touching down long enough to load passengers, and departing before surface-to-air missiles could complete their engagement sequence. Through the windscreen, the extraction site became visible, a narrow ridgeline barely wide enough to accommodate a single helicopter, surrounded by terrain that channeled their approach through predictable flight paths. The kind of landing zone that tactical manuals warned against but operational necessity sometimes demanded. Rodriguez's voice carried tension that years of combat experience couldn't completely mask. "Ma'am, I'm seeing muzzle flashes from multiple positions around the LZ. Ground fire, small arms mostly, but volume is increasing." Small arms fire meant enemy infantry in position to engage helicopters during the vulnerable moments of landing and takeoff. Professional soldiers who'd learned that the most effective way to down military aircraft was to concentrate fire during the brief periods when evasive maneuvers became impossible. Copy ground fire. Phoenix flight is authorized for suppressive fire during extraction. The door-mounted M240 machine guns weren't designed for close air support, but they could provide enough firepower to discourage enemy infantry from maintaining aimed fire during the critical seconds of passenger loading. Rodriguez and Viper's crew chief would coordinate their fire to create overlapping coverage, while the aircraft remained vulnerable on the ground. "LZ in sight," Katia transmitted. "Beginning approach." The landing zone materialized through morning haze and weapons smoke. A patch of rocky ground perhaps 50 meters long, with slopes that dropped away steeply on both sides. 3 figures in desert camouflage waited beside equipment that suggested they'd been conducting surveillance operations, requiring sophisticated electronic gear. Intelligence assets. The people whose information was valuable enough to justify risking multiple aircraft and aircrews in an extraction that had become significantly more dangerous than originally planned. Their mission had kept them in position for 3 days while enemy forces gradually closed in, waiting for an opportunity to either capture or eliminate American operators who possessed classified information. "Ghost, I'll provide overwatch while you conduct the extraction. My crew chief has eyes on enemy positions and will coordinate suppressive fire." Copy overwatch, beginning final approach. The helicopter descended toward the ridgeline as enemy gunfire intensified. Muzzle flashes sparkled from positions that offered good fields of fire toward the landing zone. Professional placement of weapons that suggested enemy forces had studied American helicopter extraction procedures and positioned themselves accordingly. Rodriguez's M240 opened fire, sending streams of tracer rounds toward enemy positions that were trying to establish kill zones around the landing site. The steady chatter of the machine gun mixed with the helicopter's engine noise to create the distinctive sound signature of combat aviation: power, precision, and controlled violence applied with surgical accuracy. Touching down now. The helicopter settled onto the rocky ground with a jarring impact that spoke of marginal landing conditions and emergency procedures. Through the cargo door, Phoenix and her team moved with practiced efficiency toward the waiting intelligence assets. their movements economical and purposeful despite the increasing volume of enemy fire. Loading passengers now, 30 seconds. 20 yards away, the three intelligence operatives gathered their equipment while maintaining professional calm despite bullets snapping overhead. Their gear suggested extended surveillance operations, advanced optics, communications equipment, and data storage devices that contained whatever information had made their extraction a priority mission. 15 seconds. Phoenix's team had reach.